Hello, and welcome to our final unit in English 151, and that is poetry. I always like to end my literature semester with poetry because one, we are not writing a third paper in this unit. You're welcome. We're doing a quote unquote easier presentation style analysis. And I feel like poetry is honestly the perfect genre of literature to end a semester on because we're able to see how we analyzed our short stories, moving into how we talked about and analyzed the play. And now the onus is really on y'all. In this PowerPoint, I am kind of breaking down what poetry is. We're going to talk about some misconceptions and some maybe quote unquote stereotypes of poetry. But when it comes to your analysis, this is really where it's on the individual. Obviously, we had talked about in both fiction and drama how we all, bring our own perspectives into how we understand a story, understand the play, what we get out of it, for lack of a better word. But poetry tends to be the most subjective. So we're going to talk about that over this PowerPoint and then our final one, which breaks down different subgenres of poetry, as well as talking about how our elements in poetry are changing from, again, what we've previously discussed in both fiction and drama. So, what I always like to begin with in terms of our poetry general discussion is talking about the misconceptions. So, part of our, check in journal entry around the same time is I want y'all to tell me, what is your past experience with reading and analyzing poetry, especially in regards to, education, whether it was, middle school, high school, maybe a past English class. But this is the genre of literature where I tend to find a lot more divisiveness. There's a lot of stereotypes around poetry and poets, the people that write poetry, right? So on this slide, it's kind of breaking some of those down. First of all, I have to say, again, I'm a millennial. I love a meme. Bear with me in the next couple slides. I would make the safe bet that the number one misconception about poets and also poetry is that, poets have all of these feelings and they have to get them out in some way. And the best way they can do so is with writing a poem. And I say that with all the love in the world because, again, maybe you have written poetry or maybe you enjoy reading poetry, right? Again, there is no, this is a very much a safe space in my classroom, in my virtual classroom as well. I'm just sort of laying down, again, some stereotypes, right? So going into this list up here, number one, it's inaccessible, meaning that it's only meant for the quote unquote intellectuals. A lot of my students have shared that, we have read, and I can't think of any examples right now, but we've read certain poets in the past, and the wording and the language and the rhyming, it didn't make any sense. And almost like we felt dumb because we couldn't or we didn't understand it. And that is very much something that I want to break down, in my classroom. And so we'll talk more about that in the next upcoming weeks. But yeah, it's meant for like, old white dudes smoking pipes, sitting by a roaring fire in Chase lounge chairs, it's almost like a Family Guy skit. And it's hard to understand. Therefore, we shouldn't take the time or want to understand it. But, and I say this because yes, there is poetry out there that is very much feeding into the stereotype, the rhyming, the language, just the content is very, I like to call it floofy. So there's no concrete story or image that you can really solidify when you're attempting to read this poetry. But the poetry that we are going to be talking about and potentially you might want to focus on for your final project is going to be a lot more accessible. And also, tackling topics and conversations that maybe we've already done within our class discussions of the short stories or the play. And so like I said before, my goal is that we are going to completely dismantle the stereotypes if that is the majority of what your past experience has been like. But before we do that, I've got more memes. These are just things that, again, they bring me joy. They're very much representative of my personality. I personally love this guy up here in the right-hand corner. Because, and I'm pretty sure we've talked about this before, that general stereotype of the English teacher or professor that, looks for symbolism in the tiniest thing. That kind of stereotype of like sometimes a rock is just a rock, right? But obviously, in the lottery, when the little boys, were playing with rocks and putting them in a pile at the beginning of the story, those rocks were not just rocks, right? So sometimes that's true. But so it says what my teacher says, again, looking at, a poem or what have you. And I think it's cut off, but basically like the turtles in the poem represent, and like all this 3-syllable language, blah, 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 about a selfish society. What the poet meant, I like turtles. And sorry, I'm like laughing to myself. I don't know what it is about the face and just like, I like turtles. It always makes me laugh. So yeah, these memes are very much representative of that, stereotypical English class where every little thing is overtly analyzed to death. But this guy right down here, which if you know, Emperor's New Groove, classic Disney film. A diss track is just two grown men sitting in separate rooms writing poems about each other. Think about that. You know, that is very much real. So sometimes there is validity, to these memes. Okay, let's go back to our the actual point of this PowerPoint. Okay, so before we talk about what poetry is, and again, kind of get into the subgenres and the different elements and stuff like that, I did want to talk about how over the last decade or so, we've seen this rise in poetry. Rise in people's interest in it, whether it's wanting to write it, wanting to listen to it, wanting to read it. And not that it all stems from this moment, but a lot of people, especially over the last, that this was what, 5, 6 years ago, a lot of people like to circle back to Amanda Gorman, who, if you're not familiar, this was during President Joe Biden's inauguration in January of 2021. She read The Hill We Climb during his inauguration. And Amanda Gorman was and is our first National Youth Poet Laureate. So if you're not familiar, and I don't know a whole lot about this, but from my understanding, there has been a poet laureate every year. I'm not sure how far back this goes, but basically it's one poet that is kind of like representative of the country, or I think even of the state. So for example, when I was in grad school, I happened to meet, this was, I want to say 2016, 2017. The poet laureate of California at the time came to my school and gave, a lecture and also a reading. And that sort of began my more interest in poetry, because I'm not going to lie, before I was in grad school, I was very much, thinking about poetry, the entirety of it as that stereotypical, that first slide that I talked about. But within this modern rise and interest in poetry, it's really changed the way that poetry is accessed, that poetry looks, and because of also social media, it's a lot more physically accessible to people, right? It's no longer in just physical books. So there's been this sort of rise in again, in interest in wanting to write poetry ourselves, and a lot of those reasons are, again, because of social media, the success of spoken word and slam poetry, also an increased use of poetry as almost as like political anthems. So if you've ever been to a protest or a political event of any kind, typically there is somebody performing a poem. It's very similar to how songs, and we'll talk actually about the connection to song lyrics and poetry in the next PowerPoint. But we see a lot of, songs as anthems, right? And that has been from literally the dawn of time. Poetry is also, or can also be anthems. And finally, just the greater diversity, inclusivity of poetry. Again, as our country has grown and expanded, a lot more artists in general, they don't look like they used to traditionally appear, right? We are seeing a lot more plethora, for lack of a better word, of diverse poets and speakers and performers. And again, it speaks to just our country as a whole. But so we talked about the rise of poetry, but that still doesn't really answer the question, what is poetry? So I'm going to kind of briefly contextualize what that is. And then again, I will further get into it in our next or our final PowerPoint for the semester. So there's a few key points that comes from chapter 11 of our ebook, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of these today. So number one, poetry is not all one thing. There are different genres of poetry. Again, think about music, movies, short stories, right? Fiction. We had talked about, I think briefly, how even within fiction, we've got horror, we've got young adult, we've got children's, we've got literary, right? Music, you've got rap, pop, country. Movies, you've got horror, drama, comedy, rom-com, right? It's the same exact thing for poetry. So and again, more so in the last, I would say, 30, 40, 50 years, a lot more diverse poetry, especially in how it looks, has become more popular. Number two, a good poem is not a secret message that one needs a special decoder ring or an advanced degree to decipher. I know I've said this multiple times in the past. Everyone's interpretations of poetry is valid. Let's see. And then the final thing, again, kind of echoing to that one, number 5 here, oops, my bad. Let me go back. Poems are not as fragile as we might take them. So we are not going to don't feel as if you're analyzing a poem to death. The poems a lot more so than obviously short stories and drama. Poets only have, X amount of words, of lines, of what have you. And so this is the genre that literally every word does matter. And then just because of time, I'm going to skip over this slide. So basically, there's 4 main elements to poetry. And I'm running out of time on this PowerPoint, so I will come to that at the beginning of our next PowerPoint.